Phantasy Star 2. This was a game that was sent to me at the start of the year along with 13 other Genesis titles as part of the Steam Sega Genesis collection thing. And this game was, in particular, a very important game for me to talk about. I mean, I have made an hour-long review of Phantasy Star Online 2 and a pretty solid one of Phantasy Star Online. I have spent a lot of time with these games, but here's the thing that makes it important. I actually have zero amount of experience with Phantasy Star's history. I started with Phantasy Star Online on the GameCube, and that game was a lot of fun, but the drop system was terrible, and if you played offline, which I had to do, you missed out on most of the content. I played Phantasy Star Online 2, and before it became New Genesis, one of the worst things ever, it was the best MMO I had ever played, and probably the game I played more than anything else between 2010 and 2020. The only other games in the Phantasy Star series I ever actually touched, however, were Phantasy Star Universe, which I hated with a passion because I could not stand the main character, Ethan Weber, and you had to get through half the game to even make your own custom character, and its weird standalone sequel, which your character gets relegated to a background character for the entirety of the story, even though he's the main character of the plot. On the bright side, you do get to punch Ethan Weber in the face, so it kind of balances out, but the point is, I don't really have any experience with the classic Phantasy Stars, so this really intrigues me, and getting into this was a real treat. The moment you start this game up on the title screen, you are hit with the original version of what was remixed to be the title theme to Phantasy Star Online. It's such a small thing, but not gonna lie, just seeing that at the start brought a big smile to my face. Now, the story to Phantasy Star 2 takes place in space. That might have surprised you, but apparently the game is offhandedly mentioning this takes place 1,000 years after some previous events. I assume to be the first games, but I didn't play it, so I couldn't tell you. And in this time, humanity on this one planet has been sort of confined to a singular climate-controlled island that is, in its entirety, controlled by a computer. This mother computer handles everything from climate, foliage, agriculture, basically everything, to the point where humanity has learned to rely on it for everything. They don't know how to live without it. It has become very reliant on this technology. So in this perfect utopia where everything is handled for them, when something goes wrong, they're kind of at a loss. In fact, some people don't want to believe anything has gone wrong. Some people revere this machine as a god or mother, hence the name Mother Computer. They don't want to question it, they don't know if they can, they wouldn't know where to start. This world is facing a climate change crisis. As is the world in the game, actually. That's kind of a nice parallel, except not, because we're all gonna die of heat death in about 30 years. Thanks, Jeff Bezos. But in the world of this game, now there are mutants running around and filling the world. Chaos is rampant in the streets. Cities are being destroyed by bandits, all because everything is getting thrown out of whack and the world is slowly being destroyed by this computer. It's up to your hero man guy, whose name you can change as long as it's got 4 letters, but it defaults to Rolf, and his kinda sort of adopted sister Nay, who is half monster, half human, and again, I haven't played the first game, but she might be the first canonical Newman in the Phantasy Star series. The other games certainly like to reference her a lot. Need to go and find a way to stop the mother computer and set things right. But that's just the first part of the game. And the game will actually change and evolve over time. What your ultimate objective is, what you're doing. It's very impressive for its time. It's not so much that there's some evil bad guy at the end that you have to go stop. Oh, you did it. Congratulations, you won. Instead, no, you've got a rolling list of tasks, and when you complete one objective, more problems pop up specifically for you, and if you don't deal with them, worse things happen for everyone. This game is also not afraid to take bleak turns. The entire tone of this game is kind of a downer. I think it works greatly for it. You know, there aren't really a lot of RPGs at the time that really had the guts to say, look, things don't always go the way you want. If the intro didn't tell you that, people die in this game, and you just sort of have to live with it. I mean, the entire world's gonna die if climate change doesn't get fixed. also in-game. It's weird to see something so stand out because of it. Like, that's the thing I would probably mainly recommend the game for, is its tone and its atmosphere, because it really does do something that no other game that I can think of at the time, at least that was released in North America, had the guts to do. This game is really ridiculously deep from a narrative perspective for what they had at the time. It's a game that touches on climate change and the many, many issues that brings about that we are real life experiencing today. It's a game that talks about the over-reliance on technology. It's a game that touches on the topics of racism and even torture, and it doesn't feel ham-fisted or badly executed. This is a game that honestly doesn't have all that much of a plot to it, because the fact is this was a game that came out in 1989. While this game is quite impressive for its time for how big the cartridge was, they really didn't have all that much space to dedicate to the story. And yet nothing feels poorly executed. The story feels a lot deeper and better than it has any right to be, and incredibly nuanced for what it's trying to do. And the fact that it brings up real-world issues in a way that's believable and makes sense just impresses me. The writing talent behind this game did a really, really good job. Now that said, there really isn't that much story to this game. Unfortunately, you can go and pick up a few details at every town talking about what their local issue is that you probably have to solve on your way to solving the problem, but none of the characters, with the exception of your main character and Nay, have really anything going on with them aside from an introductory title card that tells you what their backstory is. That said, for a game that came out around its time, it's very, very impressive, and I'll touch more on this in a second. See, the gameplay too, Phantasy Star 2. I don't know how to say this other than how I'm about to say it. It feels old. Like, it really does. It feels like a very, very old RPG. And I think this is an important wake-up call to a lot of people, because this is something that I think is frequently forgotten about or overlooked by a lot of people, including myself. And part of the reason is because this is how Sega marketed their system, but the Sega Genesis was not a console that was created to compete against the Super Nintendo. Not by a long shot. The fact that it did with the tenacity it did, and the fact that it succeeded on the level it did, is mind-blowing today. No, the Sega Genesis predates the Super Nintendo by 2 years. It was designed to compete with the NES. And when you compare Phantasy Star to the RPGs on the NES, it's astounding. It is night and day. This would blow almost any other RPG on the NES out of the water, except for Crystalis. That game still had a probably tighter written story and a lot more meaningful story. And I mean, if we dip into the Famicom library, Ready Senki as well as Lagrange Point could probably both outperform this game in terms of story. But again, if we're limiting this to the North American experience, this was something that was pretty much unique to itself in terms of quality for an RPG of its time. Compare the writing in Phantasy Star 2 to Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was a game that didn't have a story until the end credits. Compare this to Dragon Warrior. It didn't have the execution, it didn't have the presentation. This game just blows everything out of the water. But that said, it's important to remember that this was a game that was going head-to-head with the NES, at least by design, because this feels like a game that was designed for a very early NES experience. Similar to, say, Dragon Warrior or something else, there's a lot of things that just make it feel very dated, very slow, and about a million and one things could be improved upon in regards to quality of life improvements that would actually make this game kind of sort of playable, because as of now, it is really hard to jump into. When you start the game, you have two playable characters, Rolf and Nay, and reminiscent of the original Final Fantasy, Nay is completely naked at the start of the game without any weapons. So, I being the good adoptive big brother that I am, I decided to go and get her a weapon, mainly so that she's not completely useless in combat. And, well, this led to a weird tone and like a weird first several hours of gameplay for me. See, I had X amount of money, so I bought the best weapon I could for it, a dagger. I remember that Nay doesn't like carrying heavy loads, so, you know, a nice light knife makes sense. Let's go. Yeah, she didn't equip it. In fact, she didn't equip several other weapons I tried to buy her either. This led me to the feeling that Nay was basically supposed to be a burden character, basically. Like, she takes up a slot in your party, you can't do anything about it. It doesn't help that her character by default is set to defend, and all she has is a very basic healing technique. She's not very good for much, and I just could not figure out what to do with her, so I ended up having to go through the first dungeon using only one character, with Nay basically trailing behind, absorbing all the experience, and being basically useless. Now, see, Nay will equip equipment, but Nay, who doesn't like carrying a heavy load, she won't have a little knife. Instead, she wants a lead pipe. something bigger and more cumbersome as a weapon, because that makes sense. This game will let you buy equipment for different characters that they can't themselves equip, and I'm guessing that's just an inventory management thing, but you don't really get all that much of a feel for what each character can and can't equip. They don't really tell you in the options or in the menu, and the closest thing I could get to is when I bought that knife, the shopkeeper said, "What, are you crazy?" But like, what does that tell me? Am I crazy because I want to spend all my money on a weapon so that my unequipped character can actually defend themselves? Yes, I guess I am. But I could not discern that I had to buy Ney one specific weapon, and Ney is a very, very specific character in what she can equip. Her equipment is not good, and it is wildly very specific. Weirdly enough, pretty much every other character can equip a wide variety of items, and only one or two characters can equip like something specific, but even then they can pick from a greater, wider pool of stuff that other people can share. It's just, for some reason, Ney starts with no equipment, and you're supposed to discern that she can only equip one specific thing, with basically no information. In fact, the information you're given kind of tells you she would rather equip something else that she won't. And because of this, I spent the first several hours of the game with Ney doing absolutely nothing, and my own character basically having to face tank everything for her, and then have her absorb all the experience. It was very clunky and cumbersome, and I didn't really understand what was going on with it. Going through that first dungeon was an ordeal and 7/8, I can tell you that much right off the bat. First of all of the dungeons are huge labyrinths stacked on top of each other. The first dungeon itself is very, very confusing and has, I want to say, something like 4 or 5 levels to it, and every level of it has a different pool of monsters that can spawn for fights that get significantly harder the further you progress. Now, this is great because it means that as you go on, you're still gaining levels, you're still having a challenge. Unfortunately, if you're stuck in the environment, you don't know where to go, and you only have one character at your disposal, you might be a little bit boned. And indeed, I was. At one point in the very first dungeon, you actually have to fall through a hole to get to your destination, but there's no real indication that you need to fall through this specific hole, or indeed what you're supposed to do or where you're supposed to go. This is an issue with many, if not all, the dungeons out there. At one point, I came into a dungeon about maybe a third of the way through the game, and I walked through the entirety of it. And while I had a full team at that point, so, dying wasn't all that big of an issue, I couldn't figure out what to do because I had canvassed every inch of the place, and I talked to all the NPCs because there were NPCs in that particular dungeon, and I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do. Well, it turns out the entrance to that dungeon isn't actually the entrance to that dungeon. It's parallel to the entrance to that dungeon, and you have to walk outside the border of that entrance in a black void that would, in any other game, spawn you on the world map to find a hidden entrance to then get into the actual entrance to that dungeon. And look, okay, that is something I have praised Dragon Quest for doing, because that was clever and they told you in-game, and when you figured out what they were talking about and you discovered it, you felt like a freaking genius. Here, it's just obtuse and confusing, and really nails home that this game was supposed to come with a giant guide to explain what you're supposed to do, because it's kind of confusingly made. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, the Western release complimentary guidebook did not come with the digital release. And yeah, if it is in there, I didn't see it, and I wanted to try and feel my way around, and nowhere in the game, as far as I could tell, would explain that. The dungeons, just by design, are very, very difficult trials, and to be fair, they should be, but not in the way they've done it. They should be designed a little bit more straightforward, because there are lots of dead ends that lead to absolutely nothing, and where you need to go feels like dead ends sometimes. And you spend so much time in each dungeon without any clue how to get out of there, and unless you use an evacuation spell or like an escape pipe or something to get out of there quick, which, I had to do because I had one character to start off with. My way of challenging this dungeon was to poke my head in there, fight 3 or 4 guys, then walk back to base for about 5 minutes to get a heal, to walk 5 minutes back to do it. It's not fun. Now granted, again, part of that's my issue for not equipping Ney, but again, I'm working with the information that the game is providing, which isn't much to begin with. Likewise, if you want to add people to your party, good for you. I stumbled on that entirely by accident. So here's the deal. I was going through that one dungeon, I had just cleared it, and I had just bought all this equipment for my main character, and I had no money left. So I couldn't go to a hospital and heal up my characters. So I decided I'm gonna walk all the way back to the starting town, which is like 10 minutes away from where I was, to go home so I could rest in my own bed and heal up. I did manage to do it, but you don't heal when you go home. That's the weird thing. You own this house, you own the bed, you can't heal in it. Instead, you just hear, oh, there's a knock on the door. Oh, this guy named Rudy wants to join me. Okay. Like, these people just randomly spawn in once you've cleared arbitrary quest flags, and you're just supposed to go back home to add them to your party, and you're supposed to know when. There's just a lot of things that aren't said in this game that should be better explained, and they just aren't. Speaking of your party members, it's kind of weird the order in which you get them, because the ones that you get early on are by far the most powerful out of the lot, and they just get, in descending order, less and less powerful and useful. You start with Rudy, who is by far the best tank you will ever find. He gets the best weapons, can equip the heaviest armor. He is just the best character for your party by pretty much any means you can imagine. Then you have Dr. Amy, which is basically the only source of really reliable healing for your entire party in the game. So yeah, she's kind of important. After that, you get like 2 interchangeable mages who have basically the exact same sprite, and neither of them are all that great. One focuses on one damage type, while the other focuses on the other. And while they are kind of important in combat, depending on what phase of the game you're in, they're very, very weak compared to the earlier characters you get. After that, you get a Huntress, who is kind of a glass cannon. I kind of actually really love her. She's one of my favorite characters because she can equip boomerangs, which hit all the enemies, but she's pretty lacking in defense, and in general, she's a little bit weak for some of the later chunks of the game, I've found. And then finally, you have a Thief, who's amazing because she has green hair and absolutely nothing else. She is pretty much the weakest character of the whole lot. She can't equip all that much of value from what I remember. And the only thing she really brings to the table, aside from her awesome hair color, is she has the ability to passively go and steal stuff whenever you go into a store. And if you're very, very lucky, she can steal something that is the only way to manually save in the game altogether. Which, while I appreciate the initiative she shows, it's weird that manual saving is in this game, but you have to use kind of an obscure mechanic to unlock it through randomness if you're lucky. On top of that, each and every character starts at level 1, so you basically have to re-level them every single time you get a new character and you want to test them out. And that does not benefit this game because it's already incredibly grind heavy. Whenever I got to a new town, I had to grind for like an hour just to get the money to buy the equipment so that I could continue surviving fights. Not to mention, you know, building up your characters so that they have the ability to actually use the magic they need in the areas that you're going to go into. And of course, if you've got new characters, you have to level them up too. It's kind of a mess, and this game is way grindier than it has any right to be, but at the same time, again, it's a very, very early feeling RPG that, again, was trying to compete with like early NES RPGs. I see where the design mentality comes from, and I see the connective tissue that leads to these design choices, but that doesn't make them good. Even if it is a relic from its time, it's still frustrating and leads to a very, very dull experience. In addition to this, pretty much entirely when I wasn't recording, and heck, even when I was holding down the speed up button because everything in this game is way too slow. There's no run button, so you have to walk everywhere, and it just takes forever. The encounter rate feels very, very high. Combat is very, very slow and tedious. Everything in this game could be sped up by a factor of 2, and it would just run so much better. Like, everything in this game feels like it's designed to take as long as possible, so, you know, you can't finish in one rental sitting. But at the same time, that's not meaningful content. That's just trying to take the longest way to do anything, which, as someone who's wildly impatient, that does not help me in any meaningful way. Even basic menuing takes forever. You have to go through one menu to pop up a subset menu, to pick up another subset menu, and depending on which one you're using, it gives you less information than you can actually use. For example, if I want to use a healing item on my characters to heal them, well, the game won't tell me what my character's health are. Instead, I have to go through the magic system to then select a healing spell to figure out what my character's health is, to then go back to the item menu to then select a healing item to use that, just because I don't want to spend magic points. And indeed, if I need to heal multiple characters, or one character multiple times, well, every single time I heal, I get booted out of all the menus and have to do it all over again. Even the menuing is just far slower and far more cumbersome than it has any need to be. One thing I did actually really like, though, is the world map itself isn't that big, but multiple chapters take place on the same world map, and depending on what chapter you're in, it has a completely different spawn table for enemies. So the first chapter, when you're actively trying to stop a mutant threat, everything you face is some sort of mutated monster. That's really, really cool. And when you get to the second chapter, when you've already finished the mutated threat, there are no more mutants. Now you're fighting robots, which have a completely different profile for how you should go about fighting them. And that's really clever to reuse sort of the environment with a different enemy set entirely. I like that. That's cool. But that said, there really aren't that many enemies in this game in general. I think by the first dungeon, I was already running into like third variation recolors of things. You run through the enemy variety very, very quickly in this game, and there isn't that much to begin with, which is unfortunate. Now, once you get into combat, it's weirdly hands-off. The game defaults the entire experience to an auto-battler, which, again, going back to the start, kind of confused me as to Nay's role in actual combat because she's automatically set to defend, you know, and not being equipped or able to even handle offensive threats because she's not set for them. The way they handled her start is very, very weird, but yeah, the game just by default is set to auto battle, and while you can input a button prompt to allow you to give orders the next turn, effectively, they're all very vague. You can only issue very general, vague commands for your party. Like, you can't say, okay, I want protagonist Chan to attack the enemy on the left, whereas Nay can attack the enemy on the right, provided that she's equipped. Rudy, you're gonna use whatever magic you have. Actually, Rudy doesn't have any magic, but, you know, for the sake of the argument, use whatever magic you have on the third enemy. And whatever character I have in slot 4, use your magic on the fourth enemy. That's not how it works. Once you actually get into like the command setting, you can say, okay, I want this character to attack physically, or I want this character to use X magic ability. And if it's a healing item, you can select which teammate you want to use it on. But other than that, there's not really any specifics. If you attack, your character is attacking an enemy. Computer's choice. Same with magic, you know? It's weird how hands-off this ultimately is. And I think part of it is because the game doesn't delineate separate enemies in the GUI. Like, you'll run into two different enemies of the same type, and they'll be classified as effectively the same enemy. And while they have separate health bars, neither of which are tracked. They're just saying this is one enemy you're fighting. And I think this is part of the reason why that you only ever run into like 2 different enemy types per fight. You don't really run into more than that because the UI can't handle it. It's very cumbersome, this system and how it's built. And honestly, the fact that combat feels so hands-off gives me horrible flashbacks to original Persona 3 where you couldn't command your teammates at all. Also, how weird is it that we're getting a 3rd reboot to Persona 3 and it's still not going to be the definitive edition? Like, what's the point? Either way, the combat in Phantasy Star 2 is cumbersome and not terribly enjoyable, which is not great considering the grind, because it's very grind heavy. One other issue about combat, and again, this is more of a sign of the times more than anything, but every time you get hit, there's obnoxious red flashing on the screen, and basically, if you're photosensitive, you might want to skip this one. I'm going to cut around it, but it's not as bad as other games from the time, but it's still really obnoxious, so, you know, just be aware of that. In general, there's a lot of other just small design issues as well. There's not a lot of towns in this game, but one of them is designed basically to just be a very narrow horizontal strip, and it's cram-packed with NPCs, and you can't walk through them. And at one point, I had to slowly try and walk around an NPC, but the world was designed so thinly that by moving one square to the side, I got booted out of town because I ran to the edge of the world. So you couldn't walk around this one NPC, and the problem was he was standing in front of a weapon shop, so I effectively couldn't really get in that weapon shop, which was a bit of an oversight, I'll say that much. There's just a lot of things here that feel not super well thought out, and everything just feels very, very clumsy. Now, again, if you were to compare this to, say, Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, you see a lot of similarities and things that would influence these decisions. Like I said, connective tissue, and it doesn't necessarily make it good. But if you were to take what Sega was going to ultimately do in a year or two after this game came out and compare it to something that the Super Nintendo came out with for RPGs, oh, yeah, this game is not on competing with Super Nintendo level. Beyond the visuals, this is definitely a thing that makes the Genesis feel like what it ultimately was, which was something that it was effectively punching down to at the time, and then ultimately forced to punch up to and doing a remarkable job for what it had to work with, but it just isn't that great. And like I said, back with the story, yeah, sure, the story here is more than, say, Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, but even NES titles again, like Crystallis, could completely destroy it. Radius Senki, Lagrange Point, basically any RPG on the Super Nintendo. Like, I like this game, but it feels very, very old, even for the time it came from. And I think that is one of the biggest things that makes it hard to recommend going back to now, which is frustrating because it's a very important game, both in the history of the Genesis and Sega, but also in its own series, you know? I think a lot of games in the Phantasy Star library, at least the Phantasy Star Online games, the games I'm mostly familiar with, they make a lot of callbacks and references to this specific games. It's an important game in the series history, but it's very hard to go back to from the perspective of gameplay. The overall presentation to Phantasy Star 2 is fairly good, however. I think visually it is tremendous, while the overworld is fairly bland. Unfortunately, half the player characters share sprites with each other. Two male mages basically have the same sprite with slightly different colors, and your doctor and your thief have the same sprite as well, which is a bit rough. Even Rudy looks a bit like the protagonist, although he has different armor, but it feels like the characters are kind of all sharing sprites except for Ney, which it's kind of boring, I'm not gonna lie. And it's unfortunate that every combat encounter has the same vector screen background. It looks good when it wants to. The close-ups on characters' faces, the few times you see them, are excellent. Bits of the background, the opening title shot, lots of visual things like that do look quite good, even if the overworld is a bit drab and there's only one combat background, which is very dull. And I quite like the characters' animated attack sprites for combat. It's nice to see that your characters are actually on the field doing something, as opposed to just standing there and having some text say, oh, you did X amount of damage. To have your characters actually physically, like, slash your opponents, small touch, probably a lot of effort, but it goes a long way. And the enemies look quite cool as well. The music to this game is tremendous, though. For such a downbeat game, there is quite a lot of upbeat music. I like to describe the music in Phantasy Star 2 as something like sci-fi futuristic elevator music. The shop theme is ridiculously upbeat and will be seared into my brain for the rest of my life. I thought the combat theme was alright. The overworld theme is certainly good and upbeat, and weirdly so for how downbeat this game can be at times. I just gotta go back to that title screen, and it's the same song from Phantasy Star Online. That's so cool. I love it. The music to this game is tremendous. The visuals, they're a bit hit or miss, but when they hit, they're super on. And the audio, very, very good. Now, if you want a copy of Phantasy Star 2 on the Sega Genesis, cheapest copy I see on eBay right now is about $50. And Sega Genesis games in general seem to be going up in price rather substantially, so to see it at a relatively affordable price, that's not too bad. That said, you could also just get it for the Steam Genesis Mega Drive collection, which is what I have, for $1, which is substantially better. But I'm also trying to physically collect for the Genesis, so I might have to try and track down a copy at some point. You could also buy the entire Genesis collection, although I do not currently see a price for that, although it's telling me that the combined total value of the DLC right now, for me, is about $22. But I already own some, so, you know, there's probably some kind of discount applied to that. The point is, you can get this game dirt cheap on Steam, and it's on any number of other Sega compilations. I'm pretty sure the Ultimate Genesis collection that I have on the PS3 has this as well. And it did get remade for the Sega Ages PS2 line, although I believe that's only in Japan. They redid the visuals and stuff, and actually added an extra quest that lets you do something that their competition wouldn't let you do, and something a lot of people demanded their competition let you do. So it's kind of cool that they did that. I'll give them that much. Ultimately, Phantasy Star 2 is a game that I think is very important, and if you have any interest in RPGs or Sega history or, you know, Phantasy Star history, you probably should play it, but go into this understanding that it's going to feel ridiculously dated even for the time it came out, because the fact is, everything about this game is slow and cumbersome, and is designed to take as long and be as confusing as possible. The fact is, I like this game, but not really for the gameplay. The story, for what little you get, is interesting, well written, and kind of thought-provoking and deep when it wants to be, which again is impressive for what they were working with at the time. But the gameplay itself is just slow, it's confusing at times, and it really feels like there's bizarre difficulty spikes in weird places and stuff. Like, a third of the way through the game is the first time you run into the first boss, and it's really unbelievably difficult. And I was pretty well leveled at that point. I want to recommend this game, I really, really do, but I think unless you're interested in the history of Sega, Phantasy Star, or RPGs in general, you might want to skip this or, pick it up for nothing on Steam, because at least then you're not spending much. Because the fact is, if you're looking for a polished RPG experience, while you will get that, it will be very, very dated, even for the time it came out, and you need to be prepared for that, or you're going to be massively disappointed.